In general, this class has helped me see social studies in a new light. I no longer view social studies as a dreaded subject that has to be taught throughout the day. I now think about this subject as a way to learn about previous history and how it relates to our current understanding of the world. Also, this class has shown me that social studies doesn't have to be a standalone subject. It can easily be integrated in all subjects, especially ELA. If anything, social studies acts as a basis to help students further understand and learn about different subjects. In simpler terms, ELA is the how and social studies is the what. After students learn how to decode, they can read almost anything, but that doesn't always mean they'll be able to understand what they're reading. This is where student-centered learning comes into play. To read, students need to know word meaning and vocabulary, which will help them tremendously when they're comprehending text. To create bridges and not walls, I will help my students make connections to what they already know. This is why content skills are crucial to teach in context so students understand why they're learning about a certain topic. The main reason I was not in favor of social studies growing up was because I was constantly asking myself, why am I learning about this? Using a more student-centered approach makes learning more meaningful, it's easier for students to transfer skills, and I can also differentiate appropriately based on their needs, interests, and learning profile. Unfortunately, teachers have been doing students an injustice for a long time now. As Chimamanda Adichie would say, educators have been teaching about the single story of social studies. Through Terry Linguist's work, I see the value of teaching social studies through an integrated and multi-perspective approach. The goal is for my students to become informed and responsible citizens so they can thrive in our democratic and diverse society. One way I plan on doing this is by teaching about voting rights and the history behind it, different cultures from multiple perspectives, and the real-life events of Christopher Columbus. To integrate ELA, I would have my students read about these different topics using many fiction and nonfiction texts and have them create a personal narrative or response. I want my students to make connections to what they're learning about, what it means for them, and any questions they still might have. Cultural responsiveness has a very important place in every educator's classroom and especially in mine. Growing up, I didn't understand my own differences because my teachers took more of a colorblind approach. From experience, this has lasting damaging effects, no matter the level of diversity in your classroom or the grade that you teach. To acknowledge and honor the differences that exist in my classroom and throughout the world, I will teach about different cultures from multiple perspectives throughout the entire year. From engaging in the exploration project, I have learned that culturally responsive literature is not hard to find or incorporate into ELA and social studies standards. If anything, including books that represent my students further engages them in their learning. Before I begin to plan instruction, I will first create a warm and welcoming classroom environment. This way, my students feel safe in the space they are learning about heavier topics such as sexism, racism, immigration, and LGBTQ+ rights. After, I will use my students to help me plan instruction. Through student inventories, communicating with families, and other insights, I can plan my instruction in a way that helps my students see themselves in the curriculum. This will avoid a whitewashed curriculum or a single story being taught. Overall, I believe students are never too young to learn about any culturally relevant topic that's salient to them or to me. In my opinion, it's all about how you incorporate age-appropriate resources into your classroom and curriculum while also considering the biases that exist. Although I have not had much experience with family engagement because I haven't had a classroom of my own, I am excited to involve families of my students in the future. Families do not just mean parents. This involves any significant person in my students' lives. Before the year even starts, I want to hold a Zoom meeting with my students and their families to put a face to the name. For another class, I worked with a mother of a child with autism, and after our 3 sessions, I thought to myself how confident I would be just from our short conversations we had. In all cases, families know their child best. As a teacher, I will view working with families as an incredible tool to help me gain more insight on my students, their cultural upbringing, their interests, needs, and learning styles. From my schooling experience, family engagement only meant parent-teacher conferences, but I intend to change that mindset for my practice. For my students to flourish, I need their families to work with me as a team. The more support, the better. This can only happen through constant communication that is honest, respectful, and timely. To engage families more, I plan on sending home a weekly newsletter that the students and I write together so they can stay informed on current school events and what their child is learning about. Similar to an IEP, I think it's only appropriate to start with the positives when talking about their child. I want families to know that I view their child as a genuine human being before anything else. Rita Pearson once said, "Every child deserves a champion, an adult who insists that they become the best they can possibly be." I argue that every child deserves champions. In my practice, families and I will work together as these champions. To establish a partnership in their child's learning, I will talk with them, not at them. To do this, I need to address my own biases and respect mama law. Keeping the whole child in mind, I plan on conducting parent group meetings and individual conferences. The hope with these conferences is that my students' learning does not end at the end of the school day because they will be supported at home by their families. In my classroom, I never want my students to feel as if I am using assessments to punish them or belittle their knowledge. One purpose of assessment in my classroom is to inform myself and reflect on my teaching practices. To see where my students are at so I can meet them at their level, I will have them complete pre-assessments. This could be as formal as a typical assessment with multiple choice questions or as informal as a KWL chart focusing on the K and W. In addition to pre-assessments, student inventories can provide incredible insight on how I can best differentiate from my students by learning firsthand about their needs, interests, learning profiles, and learning goals for the year. Throughout different units, I will also use formative assessments to gauge my students' learning. Again, this can be as informal as formal as I decide. A formal assessment could be a mini quiz, and an informal assessment could be a one-on-one conversation with the student about the subject matter. I believe the root word formative assessment says it all. They inform me on what I need to focus on with my students. When engaging my students in formative assessments, I want to reiterate the word yet. If a student doesn't do particularly well on a formative assessment, this means that I have not yet presented the material in a way where the student can understand. For the student, this means that they have not learned the concept yet, but they will get there. Differentiation is extremely important to me all of the time, and especially with summative assessments. Also, I think having a summative assessment that doesn't physically look like a typical test is important to me because I believe this reduces testing anxiety. One example of this is how I plan on using the RAF strategy to differentiate some written assessments. This way, my students have more liberty to write about a subject that is meaningful to them and addresses their interests and learning profiles. Another non-traditional assessment I will use is Terry Linguist DataDisc. While thinking about my assessment plan, my goal is to foster learning that is hands-on, heads-on, and hearts-on. In this course, I learned a 3-block framework from Fountas and Pinnell that I plan on using in my classroom. This includes word study, reading workshop, and writing workshop. I am in favor of this framework because it allows me to thoughtfully organize and plan my literacy block, and as for my students, it helps them develop in-depth knowledge in content areas while expanding their reading and writing skills. Specifically talking about the reading workshop section, which takes roughly 60 minutes, I want my students to understand and feel the joy of reading. During this portion of the day, my students would engage in independent reading, guided reading, and literature study. During independent reading, I would provide book choice to address their interests. The purpose of independent reading is for my students to fall in love with reading and fall into a book they enjoy. During guided reading, I would place my students in small groups based on their reading ability that aren't definite. My small groups won't be set in stone because I want and expect them to grow as learners. As students' abilities increase, they would move on to a group that is at their ability level. This way, I can make sure that I keep my students in the zone of proximal development. Here is where I think integration of other subjects could easily be addressed. For literature study, I would have my students in homogeneous groups and I would help them understand different types of text and how to develop a personal response to it. This is where writing starts to tie in for me. I won't go into too much detail because of time, but what I like about the writing workshop is that students are, again, given the opportunity to work individually in heterogeneous groups and homogeneous groups. During this process, students learn and develop the art of writing. I think this is extremely valuable because writing is one of the most beautiful and powerful forms of communication in my opinion. Although I have ghosts in my past when it comes to writing, I want my students to think of themselves as a reader and writer. What I like most about Fountas and Pinnell's three-block framework is that it offers a lot of support through direct instruction, allows students to work together and independently, and also ties in community-based learning. For my students to be successful, we all have to agree on shared upon rules and embrace what everyone has to bring to the table. As a bonus, this framework includes structure throughout the day, which can dramatically improve behaviors.